welcome to our Leading Wyoming podcast. Today we have Josh Moore with us, who is a Command Senior Enlisted Leader in the Wyoming Military Department. Josh is also one of our leading Leadership Wyoming facilitators, and he's a graduate of the class of 2019. So Josh, thank you for being here today.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Back in May of this year, Josh gave a presentation at Military Day in Cheyenne to the class of 2023 about China, and we thought it would be great if we could be able to share that with the rest of our Leadership Wyoming audience who may not have had a chance to hear it. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and pull up Josh's presentation, and he'll get started.
All right. Let me see how I pull this off via Zoom.
I know, I feel like we're doing all the technology today. Zoom, recording, slideshow, all of it. Okay, let's see. Can you see my screen, Josh?
And I can see it.
Okay, great. And then just let me know when you want me to move on to the next.
All right, sure will. So basically, this is a presentation that we are doing through the Wyoming Military Department that lets basically our civilian community know some of the risks and the things we're dealing with, what we call near-peer competitor. And this what this talks about. So you see General Porter's name on there. That's the Adjutant General, my boss. He does this briefing as well sometimes. And really the idea here is to inform. For those of you who have military experience, this is not an intelligence brief. It's not meant to be that kind of detailed brief or to give those kind of facts. What we do is just lay out some information for people to just know how we're looking at things through a military mindset and how we view near-peer competitor and why that's different for us in the National Guard and the Department of Defense writ large. So we can go ahead and go to the next slide. Every rule for military slideshows, you got to put an agenda in there and you got to talk about it. So that's what we'll talk about. I won't bore you by going that line by line. So we'll go to the next one. So really, the first thing we like to do and discuss as we're setting up the way us as military members think about what we got to prepare our soldiers and airmen for is the character of war. I mean, we are in the profession of arms. So we have to make sure that those folks who are wearing the uniform understand what we need them to do. And I think it's important for a civilian population to understand that as well. And war has changed greatly over the last, especially since World War II. The way we look at war has changed a lot over the years. And, everybody knows about the Vietnam War. There's been lots of information pushed out on that, the type of fight that was, and what ended up happening there in a result of Vietnam. And then we had the Desert Storm, Desert Shield era when Saddam Hussein went into Kuwait. We took this large force and pushed them out of Kuwait and pushed them back into Iraq to preserve that. And that was Desert Storm and Desert Shield. So a lot of people think when that happened, we left the Middle East. We did not. We stayed there from there. That Desert Shield went on for years after Desert Storm, and a lot of people deployed for Desert Shield to make sure that region stayed safe. And then, of course, 9/11 happened, and a lot of things changed. So we went into enduring freedom, Iraqi freedom, so Afghanistan, the Iraq fight after 9/11. To really say that type of fight was what we call counterinsurgency. So we took small team tactics, we scaled our forces down because we didn't need the large Cold War peer-to-peer competitor forces to do what we needed to get done in the Middle East during those operations. It was a much more of a small counterinsurgency fight that went from town to town or from rural area to rural area. And it was a lot different fight than we had been prepared to fight during the Cold War. And now, come full circle, after 20 some years of that fight, we're back to a peer-to-peer mindset. So when you think peer-to-peer, There's really only two that you could consider a peer, meaning they have a capable, large enough force that is equal to ours, and that is Russia and China. A lot of information has gone out about what Russia and Ukraine are doing and what that looks like. So I'm not going to get into that too much today. What I'm really going to talk about is a possible conflict with China and what that looks like day to day. So next slide.
Oops.
All right. Back up one more. I think you went up to, there you go.
Mm-hmm.
So the big difference, what has happened, especially in the last 20 years since that counterinsurgency fight I was talking about, for thousands of years, from when you thought about a warfighting perspective, you had domains, spaces you had to own to be successful on a battlefield or in wartime operations. So sea, land, and air. Those were the three things we worried about. Those were, the Navy, the Army, and the Marines, and the Air Force dealt with. Well, in the last 20 plus years, we got to add 2 extra domains added to that. So you went from 3 that everybody understood to 2 very new ones. So cyberspace being the first one, we actually have what we call a command in the DoD focused on the cyber arena. And we all understand that. I mean, this is where we're at right now, having this communication. Cyber is critical to us, and a lot of things happen in that space. And if you've ever been a part of a situation where maybe you had a malware attack at your office, at home, you got a virus on your computer, you understand that stuff happens. Well, what I don't think people realize, because they don't see cyberspace like we do other things, is a lot of that stuff is intention. And a lot of that stuff an adversary tries to take advantage of to cause us problems inside of cyberspace. So thus we have to put what we call warfighters in that space. Now, it's not traditional warfighters as we understand, but there's people who are on computer systems and in cyberspace trying to protect our cyber systems from attack. And that is happening every day. People don't realize, but we are constantly, as the Department of Defense, we have people engaged in that battle space daily to protect our cyberspace. There's a lot of things I can't get into there because it does get classified pretty quickly. But again, if you just think about everyday occurrences and the things, how you've been inconvenienced yourself in those areas, to understand that's happening. And of course, the last one, the one that's the most recent, is the space domain. And space, just like Space Force just came out a couple of years ago, it is a domain of war. It is a space, it is an area you have to protect in space. Now, what was going on for a long time, because we've been in space, so everybody remembers the space race and our competition during the Cold War with Russia. There was kind of an agreement, that a gentleman's agreement, what we called it, that, and there was some treaties signed that we would never weaponize space, that we would not use it in that capacity to fight wars. Well, I think there was a lot of wishful thinking there, and I think we finally came to the realization that, unfortunately, yes, space has been weaponized. Space can be used to attack and take control of things, and that's why you have now the United States Space Force that protects that area, and a lot of things that go on up there that people don't see and understand. And again, I can't get into details because a lot of it is classified and can't be talked about, but just to understand, anywhere you're flying, nations are flying and putting satellites up there, weapons fly through space, things happen up there. So understand that to control that is very important when you talk about a domain area. So the big takeaway from this is we've gone from 3 for thousands of years to now we have 5 just in the last two new ones added in the last 20 plus years. All right. So we call these multiple domain operations. I won't hang out here too long, but all those spaces, all those domains are getting looked at the same time all the time. And adding those 2 other domains that I talked about, it is highly complex. There's a lot of things happening, and it goes through all 5 domains in one, when you're looking at one battle space. And an easy way for me to explain this to people is, if when we're doing a counterinsurgency fight in Afghanistan and Iraq, we had air superiority. We owned the air. Nobody else did. So because we own the air, we also can make sure that we took care of things on the ground, or that we could move, because we own the ocean, we could move things around and launch things in the air to land. If you think about, all these things are happening at the same time, and if you can dominate one of those and you have superiority in one of those spaces, it actually opens up all the other domains. So that's a way to kind of give people how we in the DoD and as warfighters look at those 5 domains. Next slide. So here is an excerpt we use to just show that this is from the National Security Strategic Guidance that was published in March of 2021. And when we talk about near peer competition, and when we especially, like I said, I wanted to focus on China with this brief. China is continuing to get more assertive. They are doing a lot more things that are unconventional, and they do a lot of things through different ways to try to get a leg up. Information warfare is a huge area, especially when you talk about social media, information that flows. We get more information now than ever. The hard part is that information accurate? Can I trust that source of information? Did the information they got, was it accurate? I mean, it's a lot of layers to this, and we all understand how easy access to information we have and what that means. It also is vulnerable to that cyber attack I talked about. And if all of a sudden a source of information were to be shut down or gone, that's a problem as well. So this is just to show that we're still this is how we're focused, and this is some of that dialogue. Next slide. So when I talk about China, and this is a big thing, what I try to set up and when I talk to people is, if this is not new, this particular thing right here, the tyranny of distance in China, or to China, is a big deal. It's still a big deal today, even in 2023. World War II in the Pacific Theater, they had to deal with this. So that's why I say it's not new. The tyranny of distance is a big thing. If you talk about trying to move logistically what the DoD needs over to the Pacific Theater, there's a lot of space out there, a lot of water, and it's as simple as this. If you think about, if you're going to take a long trip, what's the first thing you're going to ask yourself if you're going to drive through a desolate area with not many gas stations? How am I going to get there? I need to make sure that I can fuel up my airplanes, make sure I can land and take care of the troops, and how quickly can I move it? So the tyranny of distance this is what they're talking about when they're talking about the Pacific Theater in regards to China. All right, next slide. Also inside that, what we call area of responsibility, the AOR, when you talk about this Pacific Theater, it's a large space with a lot of things going on. So of course, a lot of it's covered in water, and there's 16 time zones. So if you think about the United States, we only have 4 time zones really in the United States. In the lower 48, and there's 16 time zones across here. I think this slide builds if you hit it one more time, or it changes topics. There you go. Lots of countries in there, a lot of large populations. So if you think about China with 1.4 billion people on that continent, you get down into the lower Asia area there. I mean, just a huge amount of people, a large portion of the nation's population, or of the world's population, is in this space. So you're talking about a lot of people. And then if you look at this, what is new, and this is something they haven't had to deal with until the recent history, we have a lot more nuclear powers than we've ever had before in the world. When you talk about the nuclear problem and how many countries now have nuclear weapons, that makes for a very difficult problem set. Next slide. Again, this is what I try to explain to people to help them understand. If you'll hear in the news, and as people talk about China, especially from a DoD perspective, they'll talk about the first island chain and the second island chain. And really, the first island chain is when we talk about Taiwan and that area, that is that first space there outside of China where you can use islands, ground area to accomplish things, where you can move troops around, or a space that you can maintain and stand off. In China's case, they can keep people away. And this is why when they talk about Taiwan, why it's so important. If you look how close Taiwan is to China, and it's inside that first island chain, that is a large piece and a foothold into that space. Now, if you move out to the second island chain, now that's a lot further out, you can do some things there. And I highly recommend, if this is something that interests you, look at how we fought the Pacific War in World War II and how they basically island hopped. They fought from island to island to get inside these island chains. And the Pacific theater doesn't get as many movies and books written about it as the Pacific. There is some good ones out there, but a lot of people don't understand how difficult and hard that war was in World War II due to this layout, due to the difficulty of fighting from island to island and getting supplies and resources you need into this space. So it's a difficult space when you're talking about. Next slide. So when we talk about the comparison of the China military force versus the United States. So this is what it looked like in 1999. Now this isn't an exact, but it's a close what it was looking like. If you look, China was fairly small military, not a whole lot. Us as the United States, this is what we had. If you look, we were very heavy in space. We have been a long time. We were the first ones there. And our Air Force is a little bigger. Now, I will caveat, this slide doesn't show our allies. If we were to put our allies' forces in here, it would look a little differently, but this is just what we have as the United States. And if you look to the Chinese PLA, People's Liberation Army there, they could control that inside the first island chain with what they have. And that's what they had in 1999. Next slide. So this is what it looks like as of 2022. You see how much China has grown. They have caught up, and what they've been able to do is to push out to that second island chain. So they have the force capable now to control that space. And if you look, we've grown a little bit, and we're a little differently, but we haven't grown a whole lot in the United States. China has exponentially grown. Their military, they have put an effort in to grow their military. And we frankly haven't kept up with that. So, and you can see that's depicted there. Next slide. So this is what they're going to look like in another couple of years. So they're continuing to grow. So they got this big as we saw, and now they're continuing to go. And what they're able to do through their tactics and the way they're able to grow is they own a lot of manufacturing, but they also are able to get a lot of information from us. Intellectual property is frankly stolen from us, and they use that to build their military out with our technology. So that's one of the reasons they can move and grow so fast. We do all the hard, long research to get to this next generation of stuff. And once they get a hold of it, they go ahead and build out. Next slide. And I guess I didn't on that one slide. It showed that now they can project power all the way to the west coast of the United States with that growth. And that's really what makes us pretty nervous and think about them, especially as a near-peer competitor. All right, next slide. So this is an old Intel slide. This is probably a couple months old. One of the reasons I love to throw this up and show people, this is all unclassified information. It is an Intel slide, but we get these out from what we call the Joint Staff and Guard Bureau. They send us this once a month or so. And really, if this shows, number one, the social engineering in Africa, and as we think about this as a global threat, China is influencing all our friends and possible friends or even our enemies through social media and other information stuff. Russia is really good at this as well. China's learned a lot from Russia. The African continent is especially, if you take a look, you hear a lot about Africa and what's going on there even today in the news. A lot of things happening. But if you think about the world's population under the age of 30, I can't remember the exact number, but it's a large portion lives on the continent of Africa. That is where the world's youth is, on the African continent. That means something. That means there's a lot of room for growth. The African continent is full of a bunch of natural resources that China wants to get their hands on. We would love to partner with those countries as well to get to those resources if we can. We 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 don't we do it differently. We like countries that relish freedom, take care of their people. We're not to pay their people fairly. China, frankly, doesn't care about any of that, and they will use something called debt trap diplomacy. They will throw a lot of money to get after the things they want. Um, they'll get the things they want through throwing a lot of money at a government, and they will get people trapped in the debt they give them, and then they'll really get what they want. And they don't care about human rights like we do. They don't care about what type of governments are being ran. And so it's different for China than it is for us. And then just on that last part of that slide, as they grow their military, China can produce aircraft carriers at a rate that we probably have never been able to produce. So when China first started pushing out aircraft carriers, which are a great force projection platform, they can move their forces around. Their first set of aircraft carriers were okay. I don't know if you've ever seen pictures of them, but they had to have a little ramp off to get off their aircraft carrier to be able to fly them. Well, they've got flat deck carriers now, and they pushed out 3 of those just in the last year or so. They can really produce these things really fast. Unfortunately, in the United States, for us to produce anything like that takes much, much longer. Next slide. So how does that affect Wyoming? Why should Wyoming care about something like this? Well, I think it's important, first off, to understand the China problem and what it means as far as the future conflict. I will say that as a Wyoming resident and as a National Guardsman, the majority of our force are Wyoming residents, and they work in your communities, and a lot of them. When we deploy, if we have a near-peer competitor fight, like if something like China were to kick, we're not going to do like we did in the last 20 years with the counterinsurgency fight. We are going to have to move a whole formation. We're going to have to move a large majority of our force all at once. We haven't had to do that in a long time. So what does that mean? Well, that means the people we deploy will leave all at once, which will leave big gaps in our communities. We'll leave, those firefighters, those teachers, those members of your community that have deployed before, and they deployed, but they've only gone out in handfuls of people. All of a sudden, we're moving a lot more. So we will leave a void behind here in Wyoming. We try to figure that, and we want to make sure, because part of the National Guard, we got to protect our state from natural disasters, floods, fires, and those things, and take care of them as well. And we can't do that if we've moved everybody all at once due to something. And really, that requires us to be at full strength. Because we were able to piecemeal out the door and get things done, we didn't always have to be at 100%, have our ranks full. We really need to now. We actually need to be over 100%, because if we have to push our whole formation out, we want to leave people behind to take care of our state like we need to. It requires us to be cohesive teams, to work together better, and to make sure that we're good neighbors with our good residents of our state and our nation. All right, next slide. So I think that's it. I guess what I'll say about this is, and what I try to remind people of, is this information is kind of doom and gloom. It's not meant to be that. I just want to make sure people understand. And the big thing I like to remind people of at the end of this, what our enemies have learned about us is they don't want us as a military to show up on their doorstep ready to fight them, because we're very good at that. When we can project our force to go fight our enemies, we're pretty lethal. We get things done, and we're able to own that space. So the lesson we hopefully have learned during the COVID pandemic, and what we saw there economically and what happened to us in the United States, is we realized we do have some logistical challenges. If for those who remember, the toilet paper runs on the store, and if you bought a new car in the last couple of years, how you had to wait for all the parts to show up. So you may have not gotten your car for a year after you ordered it, or longer in some cases. That is all logistical stuff. Our logistics system was a global system. So if you think about the military, we're set up very similar to that. And the hope is that we have figured out that maybe our logistics need to be held close. But then again, our enemy is watching. They realize if they could find a way to disrupt us in the homeland and to keep us from getting out of our own yard, they're probably going to try that tactic. And that's something as the American people we got to be aware of. If China wants to disrupt us and keep us from moving out to take care of something, they see how that is done. They watched us during COVID. They know how fragile our supply lines are. They also know as a country, all they have to do is disrupt a couple little things, and we kind of fight amongst ourselves and cause ourselves problems, and we can't seem to get things done. So I think it's important to understand that. I think it's also extremely important to inform yourself. Again, that is difficult in this day and age. There's so much information out there. There is so much partial information or bad information. I tell people all the time, you just need to make sure that what you're taking in, especially on social media, is that you follow up, you check the facts. The best folks out there doing, providing you information, media companies or people you trust on the internet, just make sure you're double checking their work. Making sure if they're providing you sources, that's a great thing. If they're not providing you sources, you probably want to ask yourself, is this person giving me the whole truth? Am I getting the accurate information here? Because you don't know sometimes where this information is coming from. So even though we have access to all this information, I think it's harder than ever to make sure that the information we're taking in is factual and accurate. So I think that's all my slides. Yep, that was it.
Yeah.
So hopefully that was good for you, and I gave you some good information there. Didn't scare you too badly.
That's great, Josh. And that's a great reminder at the end. And I do actually have a few questions. So I'll go ahead and pull that up. But while I do, you mentioned that if we get into potential future conflict, we would want the Wyoming National Guard to be at full strength. And I'm just curious, are we at full strength? And if not, are you concerned about that? Is that normal?
So traditionally, Wyoming, we're the least populated state in the nation. We don't have a huge National Guard, but we actually have a pretty big one for our 540,000, 60,000. I don't remember the exact number is now. We have over 3,000 members between the Army, Wyoming Army and Air National Guard. We are currently in the Army Guard sitting about 95%, and on the Air National Guard sitting about 92% strength. The good news is that that's about what we've always maintained. The Army Guard tends to go ebbs and flows. They can get up over 100% sometimes. The Air Guard has traditionally never really been that high. They've hovered 8% mark. And that's because we've never put a full-throated effort in to fill those jobs because we were able to accomplish the missions we were asked to do with that strength. We've changed that mindset, and we're working hard on that. I will tell you, the last couple of years have been difficult with COVID and some of the political ramifications. It's been difficult to fill up our ranks, but I'm actually pretty positive on that right now. There was a lot of people saying our ranks were going to get really decimated over the last year or two. That's not been the case. We've actually either maintained or even increased in a lot of cases. We have a great retention rate. If people join our ranks, most of them stay with us. A lot of them make full 20-year plus careers with us. So I think that speaks to once people get involved with us, they want to stay. So I think that speaks highly of us. We would like to get over 100% though. That is our goal. And we're doing a lot of things there. This is part of it, the outreach to let our friends and neighbors know in Wyoming, if you're interested, maybe the Wyoming National Guard has something that, if you want to provide a service to your state and nation, the National Guard's a great way to do it. There's a lot of benefits to being a Guard member, a lot of things that you can gain from being there. I think one of the biggest benefits that I like to talk about, especially for young people with young families, everybody knows the insurance struggles. You really can get a decent insurance plan being a guardsman. We're pennies on the dollar compared to most civilian issue. That's a big one. Of course, there's education benefits, bonus training that you receive. There's a whole gamut of that. And if you're interested in that, I highly encourage to get a hold of your local Wyoming National Guard recruiter, and they would be happy to go through some of those things with you. But I'm pretty positive we have a good story to tell here in Wyoming. We are a hometown force, and we actually pull from a lot of other states too. That's pretty good. A lot of people want to be associated with Wyoming. Um, we get a lot of folks from Colorado, of course. It's close. The Air National Guard's a little different than the Army National Guard because we're all kind of concentrated down here in Cheyenne. So we're trying to do a lot better job on the air side to reach out to the rest of the state and let them know we're here. Our Army Guard is awesome. They're in a lot of communities. A lot of people are very aware of them in all the communities, and we try to do our best to support those communities. So I think we're headed in the right direction, and I think it'll only get better.
That's great. Thanks for sharing that. So one question I have here is, a few days ago, you shared an article with me about U.S. officials searching for hidden Chinese malware that could affect military operations. The article stated that one congressional official told the newspaper that the malware was a ticking time bomb that could allow China to cut off power, water, and communications to military bases, slowing deployments and resupply operations. So how is the Wyoming National Guard or the Wyoming Military Department preparing for such an attack, and how could this affect Wyoming citizens directly?
So I will tell you, there's two parts to this answer. Number one, on the Department of Defense side, and where that article was focused, that was a New York Times article, I believe, was that one. And I think they were focused in on the Guam is what they were looking at, and it's stuff we've known for a while now. Chinese produced items have introduced a lot of risk into our cyberspace. The DoD has been working this problem set from a defensive standpoint for a long time for the DoD systems. Again, the National Guard, we think a little differently. We think about our state and what the hospitals and police departments, the municipalities in the state of Wyoming, what they need if this type of attack were to occur is a little more difficult for us. Number one, a lot of those are privately owned, and there's certain rules and laws we got to be careful with. I will tell you, we're currently working with the governor's office, the Wyoming Department of Homeland Security. They have a great cybersecurity section, trying to what we call harden those systems and work with folks to keep the malware from causing us too many problems. I will tell you, though, it is one of those things that is a little bit of a struggle. Security on cyber systems costs a lot of money. The professionals to do that cost a lot of money, and expertise is not overly abundant all over the place. It does take a certain types of people. In Wyoming, we are working with all entities to see what we can do to assess the situation. Is the first thing you got to assess and see where it's at. And there's a couple of things that are must-have. Public infrastructure stuff, power issues, things like that. And we've talked to a lot of communities around Wyoming, and we're putting solutions in place. But I will tell you, there's still a lot of risk out there. We hear stories secondhand sometimes of some locations or institutions that get a malware attack, and they would assume pay the ransom. That's a ransomware attack, is what that. They would rather pay the bill and get their passwords back than have to pay to reboot their whole systems. You hear those stories. If you remember from a couple of years, the Colonial Pipeline attack on the East Coast, that was a ransomware attack on their billing system on the Colonial Pipeline. And if you go back and research and what the disruption that caused on the East Coast, just from that little piece of what they were able to do. And if I remember correctly, I believe that company did pay a ransom and it didn't unlock their billing system, and they had to go restart their system so they could bill properly, and it caused major disruption on the East Coast. So it's something little like that can be extremely disruptive, and I think it's up to all of us to communicate between the government entities and the civilian entities to understand what the risk is there. And I don't know, I'm not sure if everybody completely understands the risk, but they probably have a pretty good idea. So I guess that's my long-winded way to say we've got some things in place. There's a lot of things that are still probably highly at risk.
So this next question is probably a good one to end on, since you mentioned earlier how some of this can seem a lot of doom and gloom. So with the media today, it can feel like fear is front and center to functioning as a society. So how does your knowledge of these attacks impact how you and your family live your life?
So we're all depressed all the time, waiting for it. No, not at all. So I think living your life with, we live in Wyoming for a reason. We love our freedom. We love our outdoor spaces. We love to do what we do. And I want everybody to enjoy that and not be hunkered down, worried sick. Now, I think it's important, number one, to be informed, to understand what risk is out there. I think that information is power. If you understand truly what that risk is and what it means, that's important. I think that dialogue with your family and your community leaders is important. And then I also think in the back of your mind, you got to be prepared if something does go poorly. What happens if something bad happens? We understand it in Wyoming from a weather event, possibly. We had a few blizzards this year where it made life a little uncomfortable for us, and we understand that territory of our life. We get it, and we prepare for it. That's the same way this other stuff. Just be a little prepared for it. Understand where your weak points are. If you're understand that maybe you have some cyber issues, that if you were to lose access to some computer programs and things, what does that mean for you and your family, your company, whatever? What can I do to mitigate that? What is my short-term plan to be prepared for that? And again, not I don't want everybody to walk around doom and gloom. I don't think that's fair, but I think to be realistic and understand what could happen. And again, I would say those citizens of Wyoming who've lived here for a while, that's our mindsets are there a little bit anyway. We understand that life can be a little sporting at times with the things we deal with in Wyoming. So I think we're more suited to deal with these things. And again, I think to go back and look at your life, what happened during COVID? I think that's a good measurement. How did you handle some of those life-changing, altering events? Did you handle it the best way you thought you should have? If not, did you fix it? Did you go back and go, I don't want that to happen again, and I'm going to make sure it doesn't happen again? To get overly comfortable. I think if talk to those folks too. Toby, you probably don't remember this, but there's a lot of us that remember the Cold War pretty well and what we were told to prepare. And even my parents would go through drills in school over stuff. I don't know if we need to go to that extreme, but I think sometimes we forget how well prepared we were in the 50s and the 60s, 70s for certain things, and we kind of lost sight of that. I mean, everybody knew where their neighborhood fallout shelter was. Mm-hmm. Probably a lot of people don't even know what a fallout shelter is now. And again, I don't know if we need to go to that extreme, but to be aware of our surroundings and what those things can mean, I think information is power, and I don't think we should ever be miserable. And I also think it's important too, as community members, to hold our community leaders, our state leaders, and our federal leaders accountable to certain things by asking them questions, making sure we're prepared. And if they're not, ask them why. So, but be happy. Enjoy living in the great state we live in. We're lucky to be alive this time. So many great things are happening. We just need to be realistic about it sometimes.
We are lucky, and we're lucky to have the Wyoming National Guard and people like you, Josh, who are serving. So thank you, and thanks for this information today.
Thank you, Toby. I appreciate it.
We want to thank Senior Enlisted Leader Josh Moore, the Wyoming Military Department, and the Wyoming National Guard for their service and for being a part of the Leading Wyoming podcast.